Morning, all. It's a pleasure, as always, to greet you to the 12 noon HAPI seminar from the Georgetown Health in the Public Interest Program, a program that looks at the non-medical determinants of health, including the social determinants. We look at healthcare disparities, effects of pharmaceutical marketing, all kinds of things that affect health, aside from the typical clinical things. So today we have a great guest, Peter Lurie from the Center for Science in the Public Interest. So we're going to have CJ Brito Trinidad moderating this. He'll introduce Dr. Lurie in a moment. The talk's going to go for around 45 minutes, during which we'll start you off muted, and then when we get to the question and answer discussion periods, CJ is going to take over, and he's going to call on students first and then other guests. So without any further ado, CJ.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'll start with an introduction first. So Dr. Lurie is the president of the for Science in the Public Interest, otherwise known as CSPI. CSPI publishes a newsletter, Nutrition Action, and conducts advocacy on Capitol Hill in the regulatory agencies and the courts at the state and local level and through corporate campaigns. Previously, Dr. Lurie was the Associate Commissioner for Public Health Strategy and Analysis at the Food and Drug Administration, where he worked on things such as antimicrobial resistance, drug shortages, and prescription drug use. Earlier, as a faculty member at the University of California, San Francisco, and at the University of Michigan as well, he studied needle exchange programs, ethical aspects of mother-to-infant HIV transmission studies, and other HIV policy issues domestically and abroad. A fun fact about Dr. Lurie is that he has attended every single World Cup competition since 1974, which I must say is very impressive. But without further ado, I'll pass it off to Dr. Lurie.
Okay, I should make two slight elaborations on that. One is the World Cup soccer, since there are other World Cups. And actually, I did miss one in 1978, and it's just nothing I can do about it. All right, great. Well, CJ, Adam, Adrian, Jennifer, thank you very much for inviting me. Let me jump right in. Let me just go through that biography just a little bit so that you understand a little bit more about this presentation. So I'm a physician. I did practice for a while. I was an academic for a short while, and you'll see some of that come out in the kind of work that I do. I was then at one public interest group, Public Citizen, then the government FDA, and then back at a different public interest group, Center for Science in the Public Interest. And you'll see examples in the course of this presentation that draw mostly from those two periods in the public interest world. And my focus here, as the title suggests, is on advocacy tools for people who are not in government. I have a sort of separate talk that talks about what you can and what I did when I was in government and some of the successes that we had. And this one is focused on folks who are not in government and what are the tools that are available to them. And generally, the dilemma of the advocate is that they have neither time nor money, or at least not enough time or enough money. But what I'm going to do is talk about things that are generally free, not all of them. And so there are tools that we have in this country, especially, that allow one to be an advocate. I can't solve your time problem, but I'm going to offer some solutions to the money problem. So with that, let me see if I can pull off the always challenging task of sharing my screen and see how I do. And I think that if I do this, I have it right. Adam, can you confirm that?
Absolutely, you've got it.
This is what we want. Okay, and it's advancing, right? Okay, great. So these are the advocacy tools, okay? They're all listed here. We're going to go through them one by one. Like I say, many of them are unique to the United States. And I'll give examples of various places in my career where I've used one or other of these tools in an attempt to advance the public health. So we'll start with the Free Information Act. So many of you may know, this is an act from the early 70s that allows people, not necessarily Americans or American citizens or anybody, to request of the US government particular documents. And the general rule is that the government is required to provide those documents to you. That's the presumption that they will disclose. And then there are 9 exemptions that exist. Each of them is not in and of themselves unreasonable. For example, national security. You wouldn't want people, disclosing, imminent plans for some military operation. Personal privacy. You wouldn't want people disclosing people's Medicare records, such that people could learn what diseases you may or may not have. But there's a lot of litigation around the exact limits of these exemptions, and the most important one usually is, for us anyway, in our work, is the one around confidential commercial information, which companies often use to try to shield information, and we, from the public interest side, are more interested in seeing that information go out. So there's quite a lot of litigation around that. So how can you use the Free Information Act? So here's an example from, it's quite old now, but it illustrates the point. And that's the point here. I just want to say that I want you to think about how the tools are being used more than about exactly the project itself. I mean, I think this is an interesting project. That's why I did it. But the point isn't mad cow disease, which is the topic here. It's about how we use the Free Information Act. And so what happened here was, this is at a point in time around about 2001, where there are no cases of mad cow in the United States. And the question is, will there ever be? And what testing is the United States government doing to establish if there are any cases? But there are, at the moment, 2001, 0 cases. So the question is the testing that is being done roughly proportionate to the number of, to where the cows are, right? You want them to test more or less in proportion to the number of cows, okay? So if you think about that, what you're going to do is you're going to open up a spreadsheet. Column A is going to be all the states. And column B is going to be the number of tests that are being done. So for that, you might have gone to USDA website, and there you would have seen that they said we did whatever, 20,000 tests a year, and every one of them is negative. Okay, that doesn't really help us because we need the data broken down by state, right? And even by particular kind of cow, because some cows would be more likely to get mad cow disease, actually the ones who live longer, and that would be dairy cows. Okay, meat cows get slaughtered before they turn 1 year old, so they could easily have mad cow disease but not be yet symptomatic. So we're interested really in dairy cow testing rates. And so you say, well, okay, we don't have the data broken down by state the way we need them. So that's where you file a Free Information Act request. And you write to the USDA, we would like to request all of the mad cow testing data broken down by state and by year and by the following 7 types of cow. And that's your information request. Then usually what happens is you forget about it because USDA doesn't respond immediately. And somewhere about 1.5 years later, maybe when you're busy doing something else and very busy, suddenly the data come in, okay? Maybe they send you a CD, or these days maybe an attachment of some kind. The old days used to be paper. And they give you the data. So oh, very interesting. And so you go and put those into column B, right? All broken down by state. And column C is going to be the denominator for your equation because you're going to calculate a rate. And you're going to say, well, these are the number of cows of this kind in those states. And USDA actually publishes those. And column D is going to be column B divided by column C. And that will give you a ratio. And then you'll make this graph. When the graph is made, you can see that that there is enormous variability in terms of the rate in which the different states are testing. Very many more, 4,000 per million in Texas, 7 per million in Minnesota. So clearly, from our point of view, these should all be about the same, more or less, but there's enormous 600-fold variability here. That illustrates to us that they're not marshaling their testing resources in the most rational way. And that's an interesting point that you can make. And in fact, interesting enough that I made it in congressional testimony at some point on mad cow disease. Again, the point is data that I got through the Free Information Act. There also are Freedom of Information Acts in every state. They tend to be very similar to the federal one. Here are some data we got through the Freedom of Information Act in Vermont. Again, the data a little bit old. Things have changed since then, and I'll explain how. But this was an early state that required the reporting to the state of payments by drug companies to physicians. This is where people were interested in money that was being given to doctors to do research or to advocate on behalf of the companies, to conduct speaking engagements in fancy restaurants, maybe to send them off to the theater or, Martinique, what have you. And the state of Vermont required these to be disclosed. So we filed the Free Information Act request. We got the data, and then we published it here in the JAMA, and you can see the results. Again, the results don't really matter so much, but you can see that by payment, the number of payments, education is number one, followed by detailing, which is one-on-one interactions with doctors, something that doesn't happen as much anymore. Or you can do it by value, the dollars. And again, education is number one. But then the speaker bureaus that I talked about, where they go out and give speeches mostly in restaurants, that's where the money is being spent compared to the number of payments. So there's a lot of per payment. There's a high value. Anyway, so again, Free Information Act request. This turns out to have been a useful piece of research. It was also presented before the Congress. There was an act called the Sunshine Act that was to make all of these payments go into a national database. And ultimately, it got incorporated into the Affordable Care Act. And that database now exists. It's called Open Payments. And you can put the name of your doctor into that, and it will tell you whether or not that person has taken any money from a pharmaceutical company in the last several years. So that all came from our point of view, the Free Information Act. Okay, so the second tool is the Federal Advisory Committee Act. So advisory committees are groups of experts outside of agencies. They aren't members of agencies, but an agency will convene a committee of these to give them advice on a difficult question. So I'm most familiar with a situation where they convene an advisory committee to decide whether or not a new drug should come to market. That's a kind of typical thing, but these exist throughout the government. And they're all subject to something called the Federal Advisory Committee Act, FACA. FACA is interesting because it has a series of openness requirements. And that means that the public gets a look at what's going on in these advisory committees. And at FDA, that's especially helpful because FDA doesn't acknowledge that a company has filed to market a new drug until it announces that the drug has, that the agency has approved the application, unless it goes to advisory committee. So advisory committee is this momentary view into what's going on in the FDA review process. If the FDA refers people to the advisory committee, which it doesn't do most of the time, and in fact, in recent years has done less. But still, when it happens, it's a very useful thing because it's all out in the open. The FDA officials who are reviewing the drug have to produce documents that tell you how they're thinking about it. They bring in these experts. They have to discuss the meeting, the application in an open place that the public can attend. There's a transcript for it. The meeting is noticed ahead of time, so everybody knows it's happening. There are opportunities for people, among whom I would include Dr. Few Berman on many occasions, who will show up in the public session, which is mandatory, and have their say about whether or not they think the drug should be approved. So it's a very important moment. But it also has this transparency dimension to it. And so I mentioned that I think that there's a transcript that goes with this meeting. It's about 300 pages long per day. And there's a lot of good information in that if you weren't able to attend the meeting. But there's also something else, which is at the very beginning of the meeting, and therefore captured in the transcript, is a place in which what's called the executive secretary of the committee will announce whether or not the people who are sitting on the committee have a conflict. So they might say, Dr. So-and-so has received, X number of $1,000 from the following drug company to do, on behalf of the following drug. And then you get all that information. Now, some people look at that as just prose, but if you're a data nerd like me, it actually feels like data, right? Because you know the date of the meeting, which committee it was that met, who are the people who sat on the advisory committee, whether or not they have a conflict, yes or no, if so, with what company, if so, for what purpose, if so, for what value. All of that belongs in a spreadsheet, as far as I'm concerned. And if you do that, you can analyze it and figure out how common these conflicts are. So we did this. These data, again, are a little bit old, and again, because it doesn't really matter. You can see we calculated that the per meeting conflict rate, which means the fraction of meetings at which at least one person had a conflict, you can ignore this distinction in here, was 73%. And if you looked at it at the level of the person, 28% of the advisory committee members actually had conflicts in this period. That number is much reduced right now. It's down probably to 5% or even lower. But in those days was very high. Now, as an aside, not shown on the slide, and I'm not going to present the data, you can even go further and try and associate the presence of these conflicts with the voting behavior of the committees, because down there on page 299 of the 300-page transcript, just before everybody says goodbye, is the place where they vote on this. And each and every person and their yes or no votes in favor of approval is recorded, and you can correlate those things. So all of this only is possible because of the transparency under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. So I mentioned that Adrian had gone to a lot of these kinds of advisory committees and testified. Here are a bunch of advisory committees at which I've testified. Actually, some of these are congressional testimony, but it just gives you a sense of the kinds of places that a person can show up. This is a medical device, that didn't work. These are cough and cold remedies that don't work. This is a drug that didn't work. These are COVID vaccines that did work. So all of these opportunities to have your voice be heard. And I urge you, if you've got something to say, to show up at one. Here's some more congressional testimony. I'm not going to go into all of these, but just a variety of times that I've showed up and testified on any of these. I can talk to in greater detail if you like. Okay, the third thing, petitions. So First Amendment to the US Constitution actually talks about this. It says you have the right to petition your government. And what that means is that you have the right to write to an agency of the federal government and request them to take a particular action. Okay, now it's not likely that you're going to write and say something like, stop providing arms to Israel or something, right? I mean, or continue providing arms to Israel, what have you. That's not really the kind of thing that people write petitions about. But on much more narrow regulatory issues, you could. So, for example, you could write and say, I think this drug should be relabeled. I think this food additive should be banned, right? You can say that kind of thing. And here's the amazing thing. The agency is required by law to respond to you. They have to within a certain period of time. And here's another thing. If they don't, you can sue them simply for failing to respond to you. Okay? And that's a remarkable thing. And there aren't too many countries in which that's possible. So I'm going to give you an example of that. So this is outside of drugs. We're here in occupational health, the chemical hexavalent chromium, known to some of you as the chemical in the Aaron Brockovich movie, if you saw that. So hexavalent chromium is a lung carcinogen. It's regulated by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which came into existence in 1971. And at that point, OSHA adopted what's called a permissible exposure limit, PEL, of 52 micrograms per cubic meter, which they knew was inadequate. They knew that, but they wanted to get something on the books in 1971 so that they could at least bust the worst offenders. Well, time went on, and the data on the dangers of hexavalent chromium grew and grew, and to the point that Public Citizen, the group I was with, in 1993, filed a petition with OSHA asking them to drop the PEL by 200-fold. Okay? And the agency actually wrote back and said, we agree that the hexavalent chromium is indeed a lung carcinogen. And we also agree that our current standard of 52 is inadequate to protect the workers. Actually said that. So we're on top of this because we agree with you. We're going to do something. Yet in 1994, there was nothing, or 95, or 96. And so in 97, we sued them, saying that they had, quote, unreasonably delayed, that's the phrase out of the statute, issuing a rule. And the court ruled against us. It said that's not unreasonable. And the main reason was because OSHA said, well, again, it is a carcinogen. Our standard is not good enough, but we're putting out the rule next year. All right. Okay. Well, I guess there's nothing we can do. We'll wait to see what happens next year. Well, in the meantime, because we've got nothing to do, we want to keep the heat on. We file a Freedom of Information Act request. And in that, we ask for all of the inspection data that OSHA has for hexavalent chromium. We get back a CD and we analyze it and publish it. And it doesn't so much matter what the results here are. You might just look at this TWA, or time weighted average. And what you see is that of the 197 inspections that measured a TWA, 21% are exceeding that 52 microgram per cubic meter PEL, 21%. So that's a lot. And 13%, in fact, are actually lower than even what we're proposing, which is 200-fold lower than this number, right? So what you see is, on the one hand, some companies are complying, on the other hand, many are not. Tends to make a case that we ought to have a standard. Okay, so we do that, to bide our time while we're waiting. 1999, right? They promised us this rule, nothing. Nothing in 2000, 2001, nothing. So in 2002, we sue them again. Now, you're really unreasonably delaying now, we say. And this time we win. The courts are pissed. You told us you'd do this, you didn't do it. Now we're going to make you issue a final rule by 2006. And we're going to establish a month-by-month set of targets with which the agency has to comply. Has to do this by this date, this by that date, this by that date, culminating in a final rule. And actually, the agency met every single one of those deadlines, but the final one, which it missed by a month. And they're really remarkable. In the end, they come out with a standard which is, much higher than we wanted, but also much lower than had been the case. This is tenfold lower. So we're taking care of the very worst exposures. But still, this is actually the weakest standard, at least at the time, of any OSHA standard. So now we want to sue them again. But we're not going to sue them on procedural grounds now, which is what an unreasonable delay case is. We're going to sue them on substantive grounds, which is to say, we don't like what you ultimately issued. And so we sued them on the merits, it's called. But that's a very high standard. You have to prove that what the agency did was, quote, arbitrary or capricious. And that's a high standard. And the court said we didn't meet it. And so this 5 microgram is the rule today. Here are a bunch of other petitions that we filed. We've tried to ban the food dye, red dye number 3, which is a carcinogen. We've got the state of California to ban it, by the way. But FDA, which agrees that it's a carcinogen, has not banned it, even though you're not allowed to add carcinogens to the food supply. So they might be inviting a lawsuit one of these days. We filed a petition to put nutritional information on the front of packs. All of these are just ones that we did at CSPI. Another one to add added sugars to restaurant menus. Now they're calorie information in chain restaurants. That's because of previous work that CSPI did. We're trying to limit the amount of opioid contamination in poppy seeds. Some people have taken poppy seeds, brewed a tea, and overdosed and died from opioid contamination. And then a couple of others, which I won't get into. But the point is there's lots of opportunity to file petitions, and it's a very important part of what we do. Okay, so moving on then to the media, which is the ultimate in something that is free. I mean, sometimes you have to do a little bit of work to get attention, at least in traditional media. Nowadays, you have to spend some money to get on, into Facebook or Google for sure. So it's, in some sense, it's becoming less free. But at least in terms of old-fashioned traditional media coverage, this is a free resource. So here's a guy who we were interested in. Some of you might recognize him. His name is Sebastian Gorka, and he's marketing something called Relief Factor for pain relief, and it contains all these things, not one of which has been proved to actually treat pain. But that doesn't stop him from pushing it, or from calling himself Dr. Sebastian Gorka. Now, you might recognize this guy. He's a MAGA guy who worked in the White House during the Trump administration and now has his own podcast. And like many others, when they're trying to supplement the income, they turn to dietary supplements like this. An issue here was actually just this, the doctor portion, because clearly they're trying to use his so-called credential as a way for making it seem that Relief Factor, might work because the doctor said so, right? The problem is that Federal Trade Commission makes quite clear that the endorser's qualifications must be relevant with respect to the endorsement. That within even the medical community, what that means is you can't have a nephrologist endorsing an ophthalmic drug. It gets that level. But Gorka didn't even come close because he wasn't a medical doctor of any kind. In fact, what he had was a PhD in political science from some university in Budapest. And in fact, it turned out that 2 of the 3 people on his dissertation committee were actually people with whom he co-authored the papers that got him the PhD. Not much of a PhD at all. We rewrote the Federal Trade Commission, asking them to get him to cease and desist, and we succeeded. Of course, all that means is that they got rid of the Dr. dot portion over here, and they stopped using the doctor portion. He keeps selling this stuff, but at least it's not with that particular kind of misleading element. Here's another. Some of you will remember Jim Baker from The Eyes of Tammy Faye, for example. He is someone who believes in something called colloidal silver, which is an old standby for dietary supplement manufacturers. It has a disadvantage that if taken in too large a quantity, you actually literally turn blue. You get a condition called argyria, where argyria sounds like AG, the chemical symbol for silver. You actually turn blue as a result. And that's, of course, of such interest that it got me on, what was it called again? Inside Edition? One of those sort of trashy shows, because they love to show, people turning blue. That's kind of inherently interesting, right? Anyway, Jim Baker, he was into colloidal silver. He had 46 products, and he said that they had antiviral claims, and this is during the time of COVID, right? And to say something is antiviral in the context of COVID is basically to claim that you're treating the disease COVID, and that's precluded by the dietary supplement law. You can't make disease claims. Another person who's out there making disease claims often, but is the biggest vitamin seller on the internet is James Mercola. He is actually the leading funder of the anti-vax movement. If you're wondering where the anti-vax movement comes from, where the money comes from, it comes from James Mercola, and it comes from the sale of dietary supplements. He actually went so far as to say that during COVID, the best thing to do was actually to get infected. And remember that he's saying this in like April of 2020, okay, where the people are dying in droves. There's no treatment, there's no vaccine, there's nothing. The best thing to do is to get the infection and then to have a strong immune system built up by, yes, the dietary supplements that he sells, and then you won't, then you'll be fine. So he literally recommended that people get infected. Unbelievable. Anyway, so we took all this on in our magazine and some letters to agencies, and they tend to constrain their claims after they get called out like this. This is under the category of media, although it doesn't really belong there, but it's kind of interesting, and I wanted to get it in, so I sort of squeeze it in here. The connection to media is tenuous, but here's why I say why I did it. It stands for the idea that as an advocate, your competition is very often other media companies, right? And it also stands for the idea that you need to think like a journalist, which is to say, whenever you go to any presentation, be listening carefully, because there's a fair chance that somebody will present something scandalous. And that might be your next project. And it might be the one that changes your life, which is what happened to me when it came to this particular thing. So the background here is that there was a randomized controlled trial done with US and French HIV positive pregnant women who were in 1994, who were randomized to either get the drug AZT, which was then considered a good treatment for HIV, nothing as good as the ones we have today. But still, at the time, it was like the cutting edge thing. Either they got the drug or they got a placebo. And the question was, did they transmit HIV from themselves to their infant? In the placebo group, about 26% did. The treatment group, only 8% did. This is absolutely remarkable benefit, right? A 2/3 reduction in transmission of an invariably fatal infection for an infant, right? So if you can get yourself into this group, you're much more likely to have a baby that will live its full life. Here, there's 24%, 25% chance that they will die within a year or two. So people were very interested in this finding, and they wanted to go overseas and see if they could perhaps take this treatment regimen, which cost about $1,000 a pop, and reduce the expense so that it could be afforded overseas where most of the perinatal transmission was occurring. So they decided to make it cheaper in various ways, one which was not giving the drug IV, instead giving it by mouth. And another was to give less of the drug prior to delivery. In this regimen, they were giving it the moment the woman was diagnosed as having HIV and being pregnant. But an alternative would be just to limit it to the last couple of weeks of pregnancy, for example, because that's actually where most of the transmission occurs. And so they decided they would look at this, I'll call it half a dose. It's not really that, but we'll just call it for simplicity. There's half a dose of AZT, and they wanted to figure out if that worked. And so they went overseas, which was also reasonable. That's where the infections were, and that's where they wanted to use the regimen. And they had to test this new half a dose. And I learned at a meeting in West Africa that I was attending, as it happens with journalists, but with my own sort of journalistic cap on, that there in Cote d'Ivoire, where I was, CDC had a study in which this half a dose was being tested. That was very interesting. So I said, well, what are you testing it against? What's the comparison group? And they said, well, we're testing it against a placebo, nothing. And I said, well, how can you do that? You have this treatment over here that works. Are you telling me that in an American government-funded study, you are electing to give people nothing, where you very easily could give them the treatment? And as a consequence of that, there's likely to be a 2/3 reduction in the fraction of transmission, and these babies will live. They said, yes, that's exactly what we're doing. And the reason that we're doing it is because these people wouldn't be getting anything anyway. Okay. Well, that was all very interesting. I thought it was scandalous. The first thing that I did, in fact, even before I left Abidjan, was to file a Free Information Act request in which we asked for all of the studies that the American government and anybody else was funding that looked at the transmission, that was looking at this transmission question. And this is what we got back from our FOIA request. There were 2 studies being done in the United States, and in both of them, there was no placebo group, right? Everybody was getting active treatment. And there were 16 studies being done in foreign countries, mostly in Africa, but also the Dominican Republic, Thailand, mostly funded by the American government, but not only. And in those 16, all but one of them gave a placebo or something not known to work. And we wrote this up in the New England Journal of Medicine and caused a big ruckus over this. And long story short, it became, that's how I actually wound up moving out of academia and into full-time activism. We can discuss that more. There's lots to discuss in this one, but I thought you'd find it interesting. Again, it stands for the idea of, think like a journalist. All right, so I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I'm going to probably skip the next one because it takes a lot to explain and isn't that critical. We'll turn now to the internet, which is a form of media, of course, but is more nearly free. This is a kind of a fun one. After the 9/11 attack, some of you may remember there was a follow-up attack, which was the sending of anthrax spores through the mail to designated targets. And 5 people, I think it was, died eventually from exposure. Some of them in the mail rooms when the letters came through the machines, the spores were released, and these poor people in the mail rooms, in mail sorting facilities, wound up exposed and died. So we were interested in something much more arcane than that, which was the sale of Cipro, which was the treatment for anthrax, on the internet. And so we started to track it. And what we found was that in the time period prior to this, which is in 2001, very few sites that sold Cipro had opened on the internet. And almost all of them that did were in these like gray dotted things, selling something else other than Cipro, right? They were selling Viagra or oxycodone or something, right? Something else. But then you have this huge increase in sales, and it's broken out over here. It's October 2001. This is when the first attack is announced, and then immediately come all of these people starting to sell Cipro on the web, and they're only selling Cipro now, right? Now they're not interested in oxycodone. They see where the money is. And so it's kind of an interesting early example of just how fast these entrepreneurs on the internet can act. Now I think we kind of accept that's how it is. But at the time, this seemed like kind of an amazing phenomenon. The thing I was always interested in is in this guy right here, who actually started selling Cipro 2 days before the attacks were announced. If I were the FBI, I'd be looking into this guy, because that seems like it might be a hint. Here we used the internet to do some activism. Really, we were interested in comparing what tobacco labels look like in different countries. Okay, clearly they kill you just as good no matter where you live. Why shouldn't the warning labels be the same? But they aren't. And so what we did was we got on a listserv for activists in tobacco. We got them to send us the laws from certain countries. And then we developed a scale of 1 to 10 or 0 to 10 of whether or not they included various warnings. So you got a point if it said something about lung cancer, a point for cardiovascular disease, a point for the baby, a point for if it kill you, a point for addiction, and could accumulate up to 10. And it's got a very clear result. These are developing countries, and you can see there's lots of zeros in here, right, where there's no warnings whatsoever, or no specific warnings. And then when they come to developed countries, they're talking a different tune, and they're disclosing much more. So again, the use of the internet as an activist. We also sometimes open up portals for collecting adverse events. Here's one for sesame allergy. The object was to get the government to require that among the, if you look at your food package, sometimes it says in bold print, allergens, : and then it will list some. There are 8 of them at the time, the big 8 they were called. And those are the ones that have to be listed, right? Obviously, you can be allergic to anything, but the most common ones are fish, eggs, milk, peanuts, right? Those have to be listed. That's what's under allergens. We wanted sesame, which was the 9th most common, and maybe a bit more serious than some of the 8 of the 8, to actually be listed as well. So we put up a portal. We started collecting adverse events. We got 360 of them. They had these characteristics. Again, many of them serious. We published it in a medical journal, and ultimately, something called the Foster Act was signed in 2021, which means that if you do have sesame in, you do have to list it. So that's the 9th allergen now. And to some degree, it's because of the data that we were able to assemble here. This one has a bit of an unhappy final result, which is that one of the things that results in food recalls quite commonly is if something that does not list an ingredient turns out to have it, right? So you don't say that it has peanuts, but there's potential that it got contaminated by peanuts, so it's not on the label. If that happens, there will be a recall for all of those mislabeled products. Companies hate that. That costs money. So what have they done? They've started adding sesame to their products intentionally, okay? And that way, no one can say that it's not there. They just add it in some trivial amount, not such amount that it would really affect the taste, but just enough to evade being subject to a recall. It's really appalling. Okay, research. Let me think this through for a second. I'm going to skip this one, okay, just because it takes too long otherwise. This is, I mentioned poppy seed tea earlier as something that I testified about. So we wanted to collect some data because they really weren't much. I had a connection to the Poison Control Center people up in Connecticut, and they got me access to the Poison Control Center database nationally. So we searched it, and we found 591 exposures, and we were able to describe if they're intentional, their gender, et cetera, et cetera. And then we started pulling together cases either from the Poison Control Center or from FDA's own data or from other peer-reviewed journals, and came up with at least 20 instances of non-fatal overdose and 19 deaths from poppy in the United States in the last 20 or so years. So I mean, not a very sort of obscure little corner of the opioid epidemic, but related to the opioid epidemic, because some people turned to poppy tea either because they were addicted and they wanted to take poppy tea in order to stave off withdrawal symptoms, or because they were still experiencing pain and they wanted to supplement the pain medication that they were getting, or because they were addicted to either OxyContin or fentanyl or heroin, as the case may be, and they wanted to keep their opioid levels high enough, because that's what happens. You buy industrial quantities of poppy the way you might if you're a baker, and then you put a pound or so into a big thing of water. Sometimes you add an acid, maybe from lemon juice, and you boil it for a couple hours, and you end up with a liquid solution that is actually quite high in opioids, and you can get very stoned from it. And that's what's behind all of this. We filed a petition with FDA seeking them to set a limit on how much opioid contamination there can be. Most of the opioid is not actually in the seed. There's very little in the opioid seed, but there is in the leaf and in the stalk, and one can rub off against the other in the kind of processing that is done. Interestingly enough, people know that you can reduce the amount of opioid contamination by washing the product. So those unscrupulous people who are selling this on the internet to people who they know to be addicted and using it for abuse purposes will market their product as unwashed poppy seed, which is a kind of code, you can get opioids here, is what it basically means. Anyway, we filed this petition asking them to put a limit on how much there can be in poppy, the way there is in Europe. And when they didn't respond to us, we sued them. And they now claim that they're going to put something out in February. We'll see. For those of you who are medical students, you might be amused in this one. We did a survey of Georgetown medical students, no less, and asked them all kinds of questions about their interactions with pharmaceutical industry. I got a slew of slides that look like this. This one is about pens that were handed out to the Georgetown students. We have other about, did they get taken to the theater? Did they go to a sport event? Were they taken out for a beer? All these, and you get this kind of dose response relationship. So this is unusual for an activist to actually collect primary data like this. Usually as an activist, you don't have time or money for that. And so you often are relying on data collected by other people, right? Because that's a much more efficient way of taking action quickly. And primary data collection is very often out of reach. But if you have a Georgetown medical student who's eager, you can pull off a primary data collection study like this, and we did. We did something similar with lead in candle wicks. may not believe this, but if you look closely at certain candle wicks, looking on my desk here, they sometimes have a piece of metal that is right in the middle of the wick, kind of Viagra for candle wicks kind of thing. And the purpose is to keep the wick upright as it doesn't flop over into the oil when it melts. Believe it or not, those used to have lead in them in a number of cases. We went to 12 stores in the Baltimore, Washington area. We got a bunch of candles, and we showed that about 3% of them actually had lead wicks, which was 10% of those with metal wicks. So what you really had was a little smelter right there in your living room, and people were putting many of these candles and lighting them all simultaneously. That was the thing. And so you could actually get remarkably high lead levels in the air. So we did, this is our calculus equations that we used, and we were able to calculate, I won't go through the calculus with you, but that depending on which of these 9 that we had that had lead wicks, you could literally, in a 24-hour period, if one candle burned for 2 hours, in a room with 25% air exchange because of air conditioning, you would wind up with more lead in the air than the EPA standard by a 10 to 36-fold factor. I mean, really very high. So we filed a petition, this time with the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and it got banned. And now you'll still find tin and other things in those metal. Mostly, you just don't find metal much anymore. But it did, in fact, get banned in part because of this research. I'm going to skip this and just move on to litigation so that there's time for questions. So the final thing that one can do on this list of tools is to sue. And I've already given you a couple of examples. Here are a few more. The Lurie v. U.S. Department of the Army was a case against the Army, of course, and it involved the former head of the CDC, Robert Redfield. You might remember him from the Trump administration. And he was accused of scientific misconduct, of which we thought he was guilty, based on misleading information that he provided at an AIDS conference and in the New England Journal of Medicine related to an AIDS vaccine that he was convinced was effective. Turned out it wasn't, but he made these presentations that suggested that it was, and nobody was ever able to reproduce the data that he presented. So we filed the Free Information Act request trying to get the underlying data and various reports that had been done around that. We actually won. We got the documents in the end. By that point, a randomized trial had already been conducted, which showed that the vaccine was a complete dud. And so nobody was very interested in the documents that we had gotten at that point. But that actually all came back again round when he was nominated to be head of CDC by Trump. And we managed to get a couple of, in the discussion over whether or not he should be confirmed, there was all of this scientific misconduct stuff, all rose to the top again. And he almost was not nominated, but Trump being Trump, they went ahead. We sued and got a school meals rule that we thought was inadequately protective from a nutritional point of view that the Trump people had had put forth. We got that reversed on procedural grounds. We have sued the Treasury Department for not labeling alcohol with nutritional information, with alcohol content information. And the agency has actually agreed to produce these. And there are rules up at the White House right now that would accomplish this. So it looks like we might be succeeding here. We filed a lawsuit against the NIH and the FDA for failing to post certain results on clinicaltrials.gov and won. And that put about 1,000 additional clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov, which is a database of ongoing clinical trials. And more recently, we filed a lawsuit against this company, Epic Genetics, which made a diagnostic test, which was claimed to be able to diagnose fibromyalgia with, quote, 99% accuracy. That wasn't true. Really, nothing can do that, but other than a clinical exam. and even then, not 99% accurately. So they claimed that they could. They also had a second test, which turned out to be identical to the first test, but had a different name, exact same technology. And that one actually was 100% accurate. And the reason that it was 100% accurate was because the disease was defined by having a positive test. That's a good way of assuring 100% accuracy. Anyway, we sued the company, and they're no longer making these tests. They're going to use the technology and make some other ridiculous claim, I'm sure. But at least for now, we've stopped this one out. So again, these are a variety of different kinds of lawsuits that one could do. And I guess I'm here to say that you can win once in a while. I'll just close off with these thoughts. When I was your age, I kind of thought that my role in life was to fight the good fight and to take on the companies or the government, as the case may be. And I'd win once in a while. That might be nice, but really, at the end of the day, what I would feel good about was that I made an effort, and that was honorable and a decent thing to do. But it turned out to work out better than that. It turned out that not only could I do those things, but I could actually win. And when you start to win, everything's different. Then you want to win again, right? And again after that, right? And so I'm here to say that all of you have the tools that I've had to take on these projects, except for that little bit of calculus in there, and you guys can probably have solved those equations anyway because calculus is recent enough for you. Except for the rest of it is really simple. There's nothing that complicated here. Bunch of averages we calculate, some nice graphs here and there, a few medians perhaps. There's nothing that complicated about any of this. And so I'm here to say that this work is easier than it seems, and that every one of you could do it. So with that, I'll stop and take any questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Lurie. That was awesome. So I guess we'll start with any questions from the students, and then after that, we'll open it up to the public afterwards. And feel free to raise your hand with the raise hand function, or just go ahead and unmute. But it looks like we have some. We'll start with Mickey.
Good morning. Thank you for your presentation. My question is going to be, I know it probably differs depending on what's being discussed, but is there an advocacy tool that you think is most effective versus most ineffective?
I say no to that. I think the way you have to look at it is as if you're carrying around a quiver of arrows, and that you want to select the right arrow for the right task. I'm very lucky because the organizations that I've been with have had a lot of arrows, right? We've been able to shoot in litigation, for example. Most public interest groups can't do that. Once you get to the point of wanting to sue, you're probably going to have to contract it out, and you may not be able to find somebody. But we have in-house people in both the places I work where you actually can sue the government. So that's very lucky. We have a communications department, so we can do all that stuff as well. So no, I think you have to take a look at where you are in the process, and you have to decide what the right tactic is for that particular moment. Is it that people just don't know what the right thing to do is? Is it a misinformation problem? Okay, so that is one kind of, that probably doesn't usually lend itself to litigation. That lends itself to education, right? Or perhaps exposing the people who are misinforming people, right? So that has that kind of a flavor to it. On the other hand, if it's something that's taking place in the Congress, well, then you're going to want to be lobbying, right? If it's something that's taking place in a regulatory agency, then you have a whole other set of tools, right? Then you have the Free Information Act. Then you have the Federal Advisory Committee Act if they use it. Then you have the Administrative Procedure Act, which allows you to sue over unreasonable delay, and even to sue under the arbitrary and capricious standard if you don't like what they ultimately release, right? So it just depends, is I guess the answer. And usually it's more than one. right? You're going to have to stitch together a unique campaign depending on the project that's tailored to the particular problem at hand. Sometimes there's a lack of data, right? Maybe sometimes the problem is that people just haven't done some certain analysis that would make a difference. And then your tool is research, and many of you are well equipped to do that. Okay.
Okay, we'll go with Katie next.
Hi. So you've kind of alluded to this in some areas, but in the age of misinformation, and even as we saw in like the VP debate last night, for anybody who watched, there was discussion about misinformation and trying to deal with misinformation and that being censorship. How do you think that we should go about like advocating for correct information on both like a federal level, but also like within communities when it seems to get so contentious over like what misinformation might even be?
Yes, no, I know it's a very difficult problem, and you're right, very well illustrated by the debate last night, in which somehow what happened on January 6th turned out to be actually something about censorship. I know. I feel like I saw people storm the Capitol. I feel like I saw that, but somehow it was actually a censorship issue. I mean, got to give the guy credit for a clever pivot, if nothing else. So, it's a huge problem, and as you know, it sprawls and it's really kind of all over the place. And I don't really believe that you can stomp it out one by one. There's just too much of it. It's a whack-a-mole problem, and they just show up somewhere else. So we've done a few things that I think may have been helpful. We did publish a paper on misinformation. I skipped over it. It was there, but I would buy it, in which we looked at the rate of misinformation in mainstream newspapers, not social media, related to COVID vaccines, and we're able to show trends and when it increased and so forth. And I could send you the paper if you were interested. We did publish it somewhere. So you kind of expose it and analyze it. That has a certain value. We have a magazine called Nutrition Action that CJ alluded to, which at this point has about 250,000 subscribers. Pretty standard element of that is to have examples of misinformation, mostly in the nutrition space. And people find that interesting, and it is. So you can do that for an audience that's really motivated. And more recently, we've gotten funding to actually work on misinformation. And I think the way we're going to do it is not to try to stomp out each and everything that happens, but to try to find, I don't know, 5 or 6 per year examples of really bad ones, either because it involves something where the stakes are high, because the disease is important and the degree of misinformation is just really very substantial, or because it stands for symbolically something else. It's a kind of misinformation that is like another kind of misinformation. So it's like you're actually talking about more than you're literally talking about. And so we're going to try and mount about 5 or 6 campaigns a year that relate to this. Some of it will be in food, but we're not constrained. We'll do any drugs, medical devices, what have you, or elsewhere, outside of even that, an environment, if it's easy enough to explain. And we'll, depending on who's responsible for it, you can bring litigation occasionally, I suppose, for false claims. The way that this diagnostic company had made false claims around its product, you can sue them. So sometimes that will make sense. Other times you can write a letter to a medical journal exposing it if it's a medical product. But most of the time it'll probably end up being campaigns directed at corporations through social media. And we'll try to pick out these 5 or 6 emblematic ones every year and hope that makes a difference. I mean, it is a huge problem. There's no question. I don't expect that my answer fully satisfies you, but that's just because the problem is so big. But that's a sense of some things that can be done.
All right, we'll go with Aubrielle next.
Hi. In terms of clinical trials that are funded by a country but take place in others, which government agencies are responsible for overseeing that? Like, how's the breakdown? Is it the government that is funding it, or is it the government where it's taking place, or a combination of the two? And if the UN has a role in ethical oversight of those studies?
Yeah, so the answer is that it's both. So in the examples that we talk about, they were mostly funded by the NIH, but they occurred in some other country. And the Institutional Review Board, IRB, which is the ethics committee, in each of those countries were responsible for approving it. Now, and indeed, they all got that approval. And so the response to our critique was, well, they were all approved. Our attitude is like, well, I just don't really care, to be honest with you. I still think you're wrong. I'm happy that you managed to, assemble a group of people who thought it was okay, but I still think it's wrong, so I'm going to say so. But still, it's important to have those committees. Some of those committees were suspect. There were committees on which were heavily divided. And as I'm not remembering the details anymore, but I think even there was an example of one where they met with only a subset of the committee in a way, to try to get it through. So that they're subject to manipulation themselves, either to some extent in this country, but probably more so in other countries. What else was I going to say about that? Yeah, I mean, they're subject to a kind of conflict of interest, right? Because very often these kinds of research projects come with a lot of money, and they come to institutions that the people on the committee belong to, and they don't want to be the people who are in the business of saying this highly important and prestigious research project that comes with multi-millions of dollars is not going to come to our institution. So they're going to tend to want to say yes, and that's generally what happened. Does that help? Answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, we'll go with Callie next.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us today. This was really interesting. And my question is, at the Center for Science and the Public Interest, I'd imagine there's like many more issues than you're able to actually put your resources to. So how do you narrow down which issues are going to be focused on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should say, not that you asked this, but both Public Citizen, where I previously worked, and CSPI are notable for not taking any corporate money at all. And I've turned down tens of millions of dollars as a result that we've been offered at times. We do take a little bit of government money, but it's only for small sort of research contracts, usually as part of somebody else's much larger grant, in which we're a consultant for a few $1,000s or something like that. And we won't take it from any agency, from a regulatory agency that we appear before. You didn't ask that question, but I think it's worth mentioning. That's a difficult question, right? I mean, there's a world of injustice out there every day. You pick up the paper, as it were, and there's something new, right? And you could keep yourself busy forever chasing whatever you just saw. So, you do have to prioritize exactly as you say. So how does one do that? Well, I think for us, certainly one element is, have we worked there? Do we have a track record, right? So that means that you can obviously, the learning curve will be less if it's something you already basically understand, right? Even if it's a new manifestation of an old problem, at least you understand the old problem. So, that you've got a footprint there is obviously a sort of obvious part of it. We're mostly in food. I've tried to expand us to get outside of food so that we're into drugs and medical devices and dietary supplements as well. That's still a small part of what we do, but it's growing. But broadly, so you start with that. The other way we try to divide them is we try to think in public health terms. We don't try to think of, will we get our names in the newspapers? Although I'm not going to say that never matters, because the media is part of our tools, right? We said so explicitly in this presentation. But we're going to look at it from a public health point of view, which is to say, we're going to say, well, what is the disease in question here? And how severe is it? How common is it? What is the likely impact that our success might have upon that disease? And what that tells you, unsurprisingly, is that you'll be most interested in the most common diseases and the most serious diseases, right? And, we don't try to get usually involved in common cold and things like that. I mean, don't want people to get common cold, but it's not the same as cancer or cardiovascular disease, which are the major causes of morbidity and mortality in this country, right? So we're going to look at it that way, and we're going to look at what our unique contribution might be if everybody and his brother is involved in that issue already. They probably don't need us. So we want to find that contribution, that niche that somebody else is not filling. Very often, that means the science niche. Very often it means that. You have all kinds of well-intentioned folks, but they don't bring an analytic perspective to things. And so what that means is one of two things at least. One is you can become a kind of internal critic of a coalition when you feel that their standards aren't high enough. And I can tell you that that's not always welcome, but you have to do it. The second is that you can contribute to the coalition by adding that extra element of rigor or even an analysis of your own, right? And you can calculate something that somebody else hasn't thought to calculate or doesn't have the ability to calculate. And sometimes it can be just a simple number, or a simple graph. I'll just go to the first thing I presented, a graph that shows, 600-fold variability in mad cow testing rates. I mean, that makes no sense. You can know that just by looking at that picture. That's stupid. You shouldn't be doing that. So sometimes you get that kind of thing where it just comes down to one picture or one percentage. What's a good example of this? Let's say, again, just pick from what I did. We calculated the fraction of exposures that exceeded OSHA's permissible exposure limit for hexavalent chromium, 21%. Okay, right. That's pretty useful, right? You can take that to the media. So it often involves just some fairly simple calculation that you, as an advocate, understand, is important, and you, as a person with a public health background and requisite skills, are able to calculate. So that's the kind of area which is, tends to be our sort of sweet spot. I'll just say that science really matters, and scientific rigor really matters. You establish yourself as a credible person to the extent that your science is good and that you speak responsibly about it, even if you're making a strong point. You can make your own judgment if you think I fall in that category, but I think that there's plenty of place to make strong statements without being irresponsible. I really believe that. And I think you should constrain yourself and people respect you more in that case, but that's my point of view. But more than that, in regulatory agencies, and this is important, in regulatory agencies is an opportunity to talk the language of science in ways that other places are not, the way that courts usually are not, and the Congress most certainly is not. Right? There's not a place where you want to get into standard deviations and variability and whatever the heck else. That's not going to help you as much there. But regulatory agencies, if you haven't had a chance to work directly or indirectly with one, they wrestle with these regulatory agency issues in very highly specific technical and scientific terms. And that's anyway, or our language, right? And you can talk to them about these things, and they do care about standard deviations and variability, right? They do. And you can make an argument in a regulatory agency that is based in science that has a much greater chance of being heard than if you make the self-same argument in the Congress. Now, I find that working with the regulatory agencies is very rewarding. It's intellectually rewarding because it's more about the mechanics of some scientific topic. But it's also more rewarding because your arguments are more likely to be comprehensible and therefore listened to. So people always think, well, we want to do something about something wrong in the world, go to Congress. Yes, sometimes. But don't forget about the regulatory agencies. There's a lot of opportunity there.
Okay, it looks like we have time for maybe about one more question. Are there any more from the students? Okay, doesn't look like it. So there was one question in the chat that I thought we should probably address. This is from Jane. So it says, Dr. Lurie, Aza told me you reviewed her petition against the botulinum toxin manufacturers, Botox et al. Do you have any tools to suggest how the public can support or bring pressure on this petition from public citizens?
Sorry, whose comment was that?
This was from Jane Talkington.
Jane, there she is. Okay. Your connection to public citizen is just curious if she's there. Well, in any event, whenever a petition is filed, the agency is required to open a docket. They may or may not hold an advisory committee meeting. If there is, you should show up and testify. I don't know enough about what's happened to their Botox petition to know, but if that would be a place to have input. Regardless, though, you can always submit comments to a docket. That's absolutely something somebody can do. So I would encourage people to do that.
So not seeing any other questions, let me just ask kind of a odd question, Peter. So the name of your organization, Center for Science in the Public Interest, is pretty broad, but everything that you talked about today is basically about science and health or science and medicine. Do you ever get involved in things that are more related to let's say environment or other areas where the effects on health are maybe more downstream and but nonetheless important?
A little bit. I've testified at PA hearings once in a while. There was something under Trump where they basically, I can't even remember the details exactly anymore, but they had to do with the kind of data that could be used in rulemakings. Adrian, you might remember it. It would have to be publicly available data, which sounds like it's a pro-transparency thing, but is actually a way of excluding non-industry friendly data from the process. So I remember testifying on that. At CSPI, we are getting into environment a little bit more than we used to. Actually, originally, when the organization was founded, it had a pretty heavy environmental emphasis that went away with time. And we're trying to restore that in as much as it relates to food and climate change, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as many of you will know, most of the focus in climate change has been on emissions. Probably about 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions are, from, well, they're emissions, right, from cars and industry and so on. But about 1/3 is actually from food, either from the animals that are producing methane gas, or from everything that goes into producing food, which itself can be greenhouse gas promoting. So we're starting to get involved in that. We haven't in the past. Trying to find our exact role, going to somebody's earlier question of, how we pick a project. And it's not been that easy. I think a good place for us is probably around food waste, which there is a hell of a lot of. About 1/3 of all food that is made is just never, ever eaten, winds up in a landfill. And also labeling. We have a long history of labeling in food. And now we're starting to see the expansion of environmental claims on foods, and those are not regulated. I mean, you can say almost anything. If it's false, you can get sued if it's like truly false. But as long as it's not false or misleading, just unsubstantiated puffery, for example, that is going to be difficult to stop. And so we're going to try to expose some of the examples of improper environmental claims on products, and then maybe eventually try to get the food agencies to step in and regulate these in some way.
Hey, thank you, Peter. Your group is really amazing in its effect on some of the things that you've talked about today. And I think it's a great example for our students. And I want to thank you for the seminar today. And I want to thank the students for a very active discussion, CJ for a great job moderating, and we'll hope to see all of you back next week for another talk that has to do with advocacy, maybe more on the drug side and issues of addiction and related things. But Peter, thanks so much, and we'll look forward to next time we see you.
Okay.
Thanks. That was really inspiring, Peter.
All right. Well, thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks, everybody. And the best thing you can do out with this talk is to go out and try to do more of what we're trying to do, because we're never short. We never have enough people. And so by all means, reach out to us, and we'll see if we can find some way to work together. But please, again, the message is, please don't take from this message, that's a smart guy who's doing great stuff. I don't want you to take that message at all. I want you to take out, that's a guy who did some useful things using the tools that I have. I could do this. That's the message, because I really believe you can.
Thanks, Peter. Very inspiring.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Take care.